human race as being fallen, we do not mean that human beings are incapable of doing good. We do not mean that human beings do not make moral choices. We do not mean that human beings don't have sensitivities, don't have a conscience. We are created in the image of God, but we are fallen, so we are fundamentally flawed. That's why there's so much self-contradiction. That's why we judge others for things that we excuse in our own lives. The biblical picture of the human race, and then focusing in on Israel, is of a fallen people. Biblical verses that speak of our actual nature recognize that we are fundamentally flawed. Just like we all physically die. I once heard a woman having a debate with someone on television about suicide, and she was involved with hospice care. And the one guy said, well, look, we're only talking about suicide in the case of the terminally ill. And she said, we are all terminally ill from birth. From the moment you're born, you're heading towards an inevitable death. The same way spiritually, there is a separation from God. There is a groping after, a seeking after, but there is a separation. The fellowship that was enjoyed in the garden is no longer enjoyed. There's a battle, there's a fight. Even in traditional Judaism, the issue of the Yetzer Hara, the Yetzer HaTov, the evil inclination and the good inclination, and you have to bring down and subjugate the evil inclination for the good inclination to rule. And it's a battle that's fought out. Sometimes the teachings of Jesus in the New Testament are accused of being so otherworldly, so unworldly, so out there that they are impractical and unrealistic. We'll deal with that a little later also, some of these contrasts. But you know, it struck me, if you're a traditional Jewish man and a woman goes to shake your hand, you don't shake her hand because the only woman you'll touch is your wife. Outside of a sister, a mother, family member like that. And I was about to send some Messianic worship CDs to a rabbi, a very devoted rabbi. I just wanted him to listen and see if the Spirit of God on those tapes would touch him and minister to him. And I told him there's this one couple, husband, wife, and so on. And he said, well, are there any women singing on that? And I said, well, yeah. He goes, well, remember, that's a no-no. Or as a traditional Jewish man cannot hear a woman sing because it potentially could be seductive, etc. In other words, you're telling me that it's a battle. If you have laws like that you can't even shake the hand of another woman and you can't even listen to a woman sing, you're telling me that you're subject to the same weakness and temptation that everybody else is, and therefore you have to erect all these fences just to keep you safe. In other words, we're fundamentally flawed. The question is, based on that, what does it mean to be righteous? And how did God set up the atonement system in Israel so as to produce forgiveness of sins and to bring people into right relationship with God? And there are a couple of answers to the question of righteousness. On the one hand, many times there are disputes between people in the Psalms, and one is in the right and one is in the wrong. Here's an ungodly person pursuing someone who fears God. And the person who fears God is saying, God, reward me according to my righteousness. In other words, I haven't hurt this person. I haven't done anything wrong. I've been seeking to treat them in an honest and ethical way, and they're trying to hurt me. Reward me according to my righteousness, which is simply my rightness in this situation. He's not claiming perfect sinlessness before God. He's not telling God, you reward me according to my righteousness in my own life, and because my righteousness is so much bigger than my sin. That's not the issue. He's saying, look, I'm right in this situation. David pursued by Saul, any of those. So there's what you could call a relative righteousness. Who's in the right, who's in the wrong? You know, we talk about maybe in a marriage situation that one person's trying to keep things together and do the right thing, and the other just doesn't care, and they just break away and they're abusive and commit adultery. So we talk about the innocent party. Well, we're not saying that the person was a perfect spouse, but in this situation, they're innocent, the other is guilty. So on the one hand, there is a relative righteousness, and then there is a righteousness according to God's law. So if we trust in him, obviously there's no righteousness in his sight without first believing in him, knowing him, acknowledging him. In other words, the concept of a righteous atheist is not a biblical concept. A godly atheist is not a biblical concept. I mean, righteousness begins with the fear of God. So that's why the New Testament authors, Paul quotes Genesis 15:6 about Abram, that he believed in the Lord and it was counted to him for righteousness. Trusting God, believing his word is the first step. And then with that, as he reveals himself, for example, as he gave the Torah to Israel, there were two sides to it. After acknowledging him, fearing him, etc., there was then the following of what was written. What was written? There was repentance. There was doing what was right. And was that it? No, there was also atonement. Why? Because there's the ongoing issue of sin. In other words, if we are to be absolutely and utterly and completely righteous in God's sight so that we can stand before him, so that he can be pleased with us, there must be a way to deal with our sin. You say, well, we have repentance. Repentance alone was never enough. Why? Because you're sweeping a dirty floor. Repentance alone is not enough. There must be God's grace and help, and sin somehow must be dealt with. There's a problem, though. Sin separates us from God. Sin sometimes brings the death penalty. If we paid for our own sins, we'd be smitten down, we'd be crushed, we'd be judged by God. The question is, how do we deal with sin? God always had these ingredients. There must be faith in him. He must be acknowledged. We must be God-fearers. There must be a turning away from sin, and there must be a dealing with sin. How did God set up a way to deal with sin? It is ultimately through his Son, which we'll come to in a little while. But the way it was laid out in a foundational way in Israel, in great detail, it was laid out pointing to blood atonement. Now look, people can get into all kinds of theological arguments about the place of the blood, the importance of the blood, but you can't argue with the fact that when you actually read through Torah, there's a whole lot in there about sacrifices. I mean, there's a massive amount about sacrifices. Especially, I don't know if you remember maybe the first time reading through the Bible, and you're really excited, the stories in Genesis. Wow, this is interesting. I remember my first time through, I made it into the 10th chapter and hit my first long genealogy and got a little discouraged. And then kind of made it past there, and then I made it, then the Exodus and all that was exciting, and then the giving of the law, and it started to bog down a little bit, but then in 25th chapter, they started talking about the making of the tabernacle. In such massive detail. Why so much detail? Why is it so important? This is where God was going to dwell, in the midst of his people. It's very important. And then maybe you survive, you get up, okay, you're just not used to this, and it's a little different, and it's a little meticulous and detailed. You make it 31st chapter, and they finish that, and okay, now Moses on the Mount Sinai at 32 and 33 and 34, it's, wow, okay, it's all exciting and good stuff, and then 35 through 40 just tells you that they did everything they were commanded to do in 25 to 30 and 31. And everything they wrote, they did. Why does it take? Why